The Berlin Wall was built in 1961 by the Communist Party in Berlin, Germany. And the purpose of the wall was to divide the city of Berlin, East Berlin from West Berlin. East Berlin was under Soviet control, while West Berlin was under the administration of the United States and Great Britain and France. And this wall was built and symbolized the different values, the different beliefs that the communists had from the rest of Germany, and it served as a symbol of division and oppression. Do you know that there were walls that separated people in biblical times? There were major social issues that existed between the Jews and the Gentiles. And Paul, writing to the Ephesian church, is addressing the Ephesian believers, specifically the Gentile believers, because there was a physical wall that existed in the temple of God that separated the Jews and the Gentiles. In other words, the Jews could go into a certain part of the temple, but they could not go past the wall. So let's look at some reasons that Paul felt like he needed to address the wall that existed between Jews and Gentiles. First of all, there was a social separation. And we read about that in chapter 2, verse number 11. Therefore remember that formerly, you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called the uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. So Paul addresses the Gentile believers. He's talking to the Gentiles that were a part of the church in Ephesus, made up of Jews and Gentiles. And he's addressing them because he knew they had different social issues, different social practices. They ate different kind of food. They dressed differently. They had different laws. They had different beliefs. And when you go back to the Old Testament, the moment God called Abraham and started the Jewish people, he made a distinct difference between the Jews and the Gentiles. So there were differences between these two groups of people. And his intention, I should say, in calling Abraham and starting the Jewish people was that they would worship him, that they would follow God, and that they would be a witness or an example to the Gentiles. The problem was the Jews were not an example. They, because they were the people of God, used that as a wedge between them and the Gentiles. They felt superior, they felt more righteous, they were arrogant, and they looked down their nose at the Gentiles. So get the picture. In the church at Ephesus, you had Jewish believers that came to Christ, and you had Gentile believers that came to Christ. And they're trying to figure out, with all these historical problems that existed in this wall, this social wall that existed between them, how are they going to worship together and get along? Now, Paul uses the word here, uncircumcision. That is a very derogatory term. Because the Jews that were called by God, the males were physically circumcised, and that was a sign of a covenant that they had entered with God. And because they had entered this covenant and they were circumcised in the flesh, they considered the uncircumcised Gentiles to be second-class citizens. So again, the Jews looked down their nose at the Gentiles. Yes, even the Gentile believers are their now brothers and sisters in Christ. And in fact, it was so bad that at times the Jewish people would pray, I give thanks to you, O God, that I'm a Hebrew and not a Gentile. So this was a real big problem that existed in the church, this wall of social separation between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. And there was clearly a spiritual separation, and we read about that in the 12th verse. Paul said, remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in this world. So obviously, spiritual separation is the most serious separation that can exist. And the two words that really describe the condition of the Gentiles before they came to Christ was excluded and without. Two very important words, excluded and from without. So let's dig a little deeper here. Paul talks about them being separated or separate from Christ. So before they became Christians, they were lost. They didn't know God through Christ. They were worshiping pagan gods. They had no concept of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God of the Jews. And they had no concept of God sending his son Jesus to die on a cross for their sin. Okay? So they were separated from Christ. Paul says they were excluded from the commonwealth. The word commonwealth really means community or citizenship. And anytime you're a part of a commonwealth or you're a citizen, you have certain rights that people outside of the commonwealth don't have. God chose the Hebrews as his people. And because he chose them, he made a nation and ruled over them as king. God was king over the Jews. He was Lord over the Jews. He was the God of the Jews. It was a theocracy. And God blessed Israel, but the Gentiles were excluded from those blessings, okay? They were on the outside looking in, separated from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth, and then Paul says they were strangers to the covenants. Again, he's talking to the Gentile believers and reminding them of the wall that existed before they came to Christ, okay? So when God called Abraham, he made a covenant with Abraham. And the word covenant basically means a divine agreement. God enters a divine agreement or a covenant in which he binds himself to fulfill his promises of protection and provision and prosperity for the people that he enters the covenant with. Now, God in the covenant or the agreement says, I will do this. And then Israel's responsibility or man's requirement is to put their faith in God and then obey the terms of the covenant, okay? In other words, if you do this, God says he'll do that. So Israel had a covenant with God. In fact, they had many covenants with God. The covenant God cut with Abraham, we read about it in Genesis chapter 12. It says, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. God talking to Abraham. And so you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So this is the covenant that God entered with Abraham when God, through Abraham, started the Jewish people or the nation of Israel. The Gentiles, again, were alienated from this covenant and all the other covenants, the Davidic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the New Covenant, all the covenants that God had with Israel. The Gentiles were on the outside looking in. Why? Because they were separated from Christ. They were excluded from the commonwealth. And then he says here they had no hope. So it just keeps getting worse. They had no hope because they were worshiping idols. They had no spiritual hope. I want to remind you tonight that without a relationship with God, without a relationship with Jesus Christ, there is no hope. Jesus is the one that provides hope. So Paul is saying to the Gentiles, hey, this wall existed. It was a social wall of separation. It was a spiritual wall of separation. They had no hope. And then last, they were without God. That's really the bottom line. They were without God. Now the Gentiles worship gods. They had different religions. They worshiped many different gods, but they were pagans, statues, whatever it might be. And if you don't have a relationship with God, you have no hope because you are without God in the world. No God means no hope, and no hope means no life. So again, the Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Ephesus, made up of Jewish believers and Gentile believers, Paul is reminding the Gentiles of where they were before Christ. Listen to me. Jesus came to break down the walls, social walls, religious walls. I don't care who you are. I don't care what your background is. I don't care what your race is. I don't care what your former religion is or was. I don't care what your culture is. If you come to Christ, all of the walls that separate people are broken down through Jesus. We'll talk more about this next week. In the meantime, thanks for being here tonight. I'll see you Sunday morning, 9:15, 11:15, right here in the big house.